Hi guys, and welcome back. So last lesson we looked at the terms of the treaty, and today we're going to actually look at the German population's reaction and also the political impact that the terms had on them. So throughout the Weimar Republic's history, its opponents laid the blame for Germany's humiliation at Versailles at the door of the new republic and the November criminals who had stabbed the German army in the back. But did the democratic regime's association with the Treaty of Versailles actually severely weaken its prospects for survival? It is certainly true that post-imperial Germany, internally divided over almost everything else, was united in its shared hatred of the treaty. However, how were they going to respond caused even further friction. Clearly, the treaty was considered to be very different from President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and many Germans found it impossible to understand how and why the guiding principle of self-determination was not applied in a number of cases to Germany, such as in Austria with Anschluss, Danzig, Upper Silesia, and the Saarland. Millions of Germans who spoke German and considered themselves German were now living in non-German states, such as Czechoslovakia and Poland. Similarly, they couldn't grasp the loss of Germany's colonies when Wilson's 14 points had called for an impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. Article 231 was seen as an unjust national humiliation, since most Germans argued that Germany couldn't be held solely responsible for the outbreak of the war, when they had fought for defensive reasons because their country had been threatened by encirclement from the Allies. The extent of the reparations payments were a major source of anger, as they knew it would cripple the German economy, and the fact that the exact figure wasn't actually decided upon until 1921, which amounted to, from the German viewpoint, them being forced to sign a blank check. Now, the Allies perhaps realized that such a broad definition of financial liability was likely to lead to unrealistic claims beyond Germany's ability to pay. Yet they were also very aware and conscious on the reparations issue, that it would outrage their domestic electorates if they were to make any concessions, because so many people were still reeling from the devastations of war. Allied occupations of parts of Western Germany and French control of the Saarland coal mine led to continuing friction. German nationalists were outraged by the outlawing of nationalist groups and banning of German patriotic songs and festivals in areas under French control. The imposition of the disarmament clauses was also seen as grossly unfair, because when Britain and France remained highly armed and made no further commitments to disarm, why should Germany feel that they have to do the same? Or why should Germany feel that they should have to do it? Finally, Germany's exclusion from the League of Nations, they found very hard to bear in terms of their pride, because whilst it was still forced to accept the terms of the covenant, it was seen as unjust discrimination against a proud and once powerful nation. But just how justified were these German complaints about the Treaty of Versailles? Was their horror at the treaty justified? It is possible to sympathise with the German reaction in some aspects, as I've just mentioned, including the hope of self-determination from Wilson's 14 points, the crippling reparations, and exclusion from the League of Nations. But remember too that Germany had agreed to an armistice, not a surrender. But in some ways, Germany's reaction was based on unrealistic expectations. For starters, Wilson's 14 points and the armistice agreement from November 1918 had made clear that Alsace-Lorraine would have been returned to France, a new state of Poland with access to the sea would be created, that Germany would be expected to hand over assets, and considerable disarmament was expected. Plebiscites were also held in Schleswig, Silesia, and parts of Prussia, and so therefore that decision was actually made democratically and not necessarily as a diktat. Also, the treaty could have been even more severe. Had Clemenceau, the French president had his way, he would have extended the French border to the Rhine or annexed the Saar coalfields and also created an independent Rhineland. And if you remember, the Rhineland in this case has only been demilitarized. It hasn't actually been taken away from Germany. The French also wanted to ensure that Germany couldn't threaten them again, but the Allies, in terms of Britain and the USA, actually resisted this as they wanted Germany to remain strong enough to withstand the spread of communism from Russia that would now be coming over after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Also, the treaty did not punish Germany as severely as Germany had punished Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Then Germany had broken up the western part of the Russian Empire and annexed large areas of territory. If you can see behind me, all the areas in yellow. In the Reichstag debate on that treaty, only the USPD had actually voted against this action. Germany's war aims of 1914 had included the annexation of territory from its enemies, the expansion of Germany's colonial empire, and a very severe reparations bill to be paid by the defeated Allies. In other words, if Germany had won the war, the peace settlement would have been very harsh on the defeated Allies. And finally, Germany was not physically occupied during the war, and as a result, the real damage was actually suffered on foreign soil, i.e. in France and Belgium. Even still, Versailles led to other fatal issues and had lasting consequences for the Weimar Republic. So what was the political effect of the peace treaty? Well, the cartoon behind me shows the German hatred for the Allied peacemakers. You have the three key allies there who are about to execute Germany, and Clemenceau is holding the guillotine string, which just demonstrates how the Germans saw the French as one of the key figureheads in promoting such a harsh terms for peace. So yes, there's hatred towards the Allies, but there's also hatred transferred to the German politicians who had signed the treaty. When the harsh terms were revealed to the German government in May 1919, ministers from all parties shared Chancellor Schiedemann's view that accepting it would be incompatible with German honor. Schiedemann's speech in the German National Assembly on the 12th of May 1919 actually stated, "Which hand would not wither that binds itself and us in these chains?" So he's viewing himself there, he's viewing Germany as actually a prisoner of the Allies. And at that stage, however, it seemed possible still to negotiate some amendments of the treaty, but actually, in the actual event, the rejection of German requests for extensive changes and the demand for acceptance of the treaty within 7 days caused a political crisis in Germany. Scheidemann and some of his ministers wanted to reject the treaty, whereas the majority of the cabinet and of the SPD members of the Reichstag believed that Germany had no other choice but to sign it. So Scheidemann had to resign, and a new coalition cabinet led by Gustav Bauer was formed. Now, Bauer had been a trade union official before he entered the Reichstag as an SPD deputy in 1912. In the political upheaval of 1918 to 19, he was appointed as Minister of Labour in the cabinets of, first of all, Prince Max, then in the cabinet of Ebert, and then also in the cabinet of Scheidemann. After Scheidemann resigned in June 1920, Bauer became Chancellor, but he was forced to resign in March 1920 after the Kapp Putsch. Going back there, Scheidemann resigned in June 1919. Bauer was forced to resign in March 1920 after the Kapp Putsch. He continued to serve as minister and a Reichstag deputy for several more years. Meanwhile, as Bauer was establishing himself, some high-ranking officers in the German military, with the support of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, were discussing the possibility of resisting the signing of the treaty through renewed military action. President Ebert told General Groener that he would support rejection of the treaty if there was any chance that military action could actually be successful. So we almost have this alliance between the president and the army again, actually coming into force. But Groener was a realist, And as a general of the army, he informed Ebert that military resistance would actually be futile, and Germany had no alternative but to accept the treaty. So the Bauer cabinet bowed to the inevitable and signed the treaty with reluctant acceptance in the Reichstag of 237 votes to 138, as I've discussed before.